Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If you want to improve your playing, join me and thousands of other pickers getting better every day at pegheadnation.com. Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. Welcome to Bluegrass Jam Along. If I could tell you there is one song that dates back generations and has been recorded by McCoury, Nina Simone, Merle Travis, Doc Watson, Pete Seeger, Alison, Krauss and David Bowie, you might want to know what that song is. And the great news is I've got somebody here who can tell us all about that. Dan Gutstein is joining me to tell us all about his book, Poor Gal, The Cultural History of Little Liza Jane. Dan, welcome to Bluegrass Jam Along.
Thank you for having me. Liza Jane in Fits and Starts is that song, I believe.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating thing because what I love about this book is what I love about any book that deals with history in a way is that it tells a big story via a small starting point. And I love those kinds of books. And I'm just really curious as to how you came to write this book, because I know it's part of a bigger overall project. It's not just a book. There's much more going on behind the scenes with this as well.
Right. So I believe that I heard my first Liza Jane song some years ago when I was DJing off of 50s and 60s rock and roll records, many of which were vinyl. And so I came across this version by Art Neville, and this was a young Art Neville recording on the Cinderella label in New Orleans, and it was just a song that spoke to me. It was kind of there's a good rhythm to it. It's a medium burn, but it was kind of haunting, and I'm like, what is this? And a little bit of poking around revealed all the different genres that the song was appearing in, and a sort of history that some people were sort of sketching out but hadn't really fully been gone into. And so, yeah, a colleague of mine and I decided to launch a documentary film project, which is still ongoing. We're a little impoverished, but we're working on that. But during the pandemic, when I was a caregiver to my father, I had a little bit of time, and at the urging of a saintly, scholarly individual named David Evans, I wrote the book. And there's so much more to say than that, but that's sort of the overall trajectory of things in getting to the book writing.
And why this song? Why a book about Little Liza Jane and the variations upon that song? Why did you sort of land on this one?
Liza Jane is, I can recite the various transcendences that we have here. From, old to young, generational, from one region to another, from across the color line and back and forth over and over again. I think that when you consider the sum of all these things, including the transportation of the song into as many genres as exist in the United States and elsewhere, we see something that is not just a simple constellation, but maybe a galaxy or even greater. And there is a lot also that's, enough, I guess. But there's also a sense of like, this is where an American folk song came from. We can see that there may be African influences in terms of the vocal tradition, and there may have been other influences that sparked the lyrics into place. It could have been the Scottish poet Robert Burns, or even a minstrel song. But at the end of the day, this is an American song invented by enslaved people who turned to the song during celebrations as a joyous, loud way of exceeding their circumstances, something that I won't pretend to understand. And so, we have and then the book tries to trace all of the ways that the song then traded hands back and forth. And it really becomes, not just like all the transcendences, like I said, but as the United States, as American musicians generated the American School of Music, which initially had to be jazz, we see Liza Jane there as an improvisational song, a moldable, flexible, elastic song with a lot of improvisation, the same way jazz was. And then we see that sort of flexibility extended to all the different genres where the song can go. And yeah, Liza Jane was definitely there when jazz formed in Louis Armstrong's New Orleans in the early 1900s.
And how do you go about kind of telling that story? Do you sort of start by seeing how far back you can go, how far back you can trace something, or do you sort of take what there is and then kind of pull on the threads and see where it takes you?
Everything. It was a fractal situation rather than a linear one in many ways. And part of that is because there isn't just one song, there are branches. So we have Little Liza Jane, we have Goodbye Liza Jane, the Liza Porgal songs, which became popular as country music also became popular in the 1920s. We have Steel Miss Liza, which is a great little folk song, and I have to remind myself that there was a guy named Little Richard who did something with that. And then we have, other songs where the Liza Jane character sort of intrudes. So we have Pig in a Pan from Old and in the Way and Jerry Garcia. We have Ralph Stanley, Rocky Island, the great. There are numerous other great examples like Woe Mule and songs of that kind that, there she is, even though she's not in the title. So how do you handle all that in a book? And so simply a simple, straight, linear retelling was really not possible. And the book had to sort of weave in and out of historical periods. Ultimately, there was a quest for, an origin story. And that is not something we can state with certainty, although I would say that it is 99 and 44/100% sure that these songs originated among enslaved people. And then from there, it was just trying to track not just the progressions of the songs as they reached other people, but the way that they interacted with one another. There is Fiddle and John Carson, for example, a complicated figure, a sort of racist, bigoted guy, but his version of Liza Jane, which he calls Goodbye Liza Jane, is really a melding of three different traditions. Oh, little Liza, poor girl. Oh, little Liza Jane. Oh, little Liza, poor girl. Goodbye, Liza Jane. And so you have Little Liza Jane, you have Goodbye Liza Jane, you have the poor gal, come in. And so, what do you do with all that? And it's really just trying to be as linear as possible, but I find myself stitching in and out of time periods as best as I can.
It's really interesting that what you were saying about sort of Liza Jane as a character cropping up in other songs, and is that a consistent character across those songs? Is there a kind of a thread that feels like this is the same person? We'll be right back with you just after this. The long-awaited Hill Country series from Collins Guitars represents a new voice in their acoustic lineup. Rooted deep in the bluegrass world, these new Dreadnought and OM models feature a strong fundamental tone with a dry, warm and woody character that's sure to catch the attention of players who hold the vintage instruments of the 30s in their highest regard. Watch world-class pickers Jake Workman, Kenny Smith and Bob Minner perform with new Hill Country instruments on the Collins Guitars YouTube channel, and learn more at collinsguitars.com. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. With 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music, Peghead Nation has something for every picker. You'll learn the tunes and techniques you need to join in at jams and play the music you love, plus advanced techniques like improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 per month, and you can add more for $10 a month. Sign up for any course and get your first month free with the promo code JAMALONG, all one word. Join thousands of other players, including me, who are advancing on their instruments and having more fun playing the roots music they love at pegheadnation.com.
Yeah, in many cases that's true, because she tends to be a reluctant courtship interest that the singer is pursuing. So the singer is promising her things, if you, as Huey Piano Smith from 1956 in New Orleans, sings, you can wear my ring if you'd be my girl, but there's doubt there, right? That if you are my girl, you can have this. And a lot of the country versions are said to be, comic renditions where the Liza Jane character is kind of insulted and, looked at as there's all these sort of unsavory details about her and so on, because she won't say yes. And so there is, generally speaking, that kind of thing. And she becomes a really powerful force in a lot of ways, because she is being sought after, but not quite agreeing, not quite saying I do. And so I think that character is somewhat repeated across many of these different genres, styles, recordings, and so forth. And she's maybe there was the Hillbillies from, I think this is 1926, who recorded their Liza Jane song, a poor gal song that they called Mountaineer's Love Song. And so sort of establishing this Liza Jane character as the ubiquitous Appalachian love interest. And so, I think that's a fair thing to say.
And it's interesting because you talk about versions of the song, and it feels like there are different interrelated songs, different versions of the same song, and there's this idea of kind of chunks of lyric that get sort of plonked, and then the phrase uses snotches for these sort of elements of a song that might. This is something that's familiar to people who've heard, I don't know, for example, Sitting on Top of the World, but also the rock and roll track Matchbox, like this idea, if you don't want my peaches, don't shake my tree, which goes back to all sorts of blues records, and these sorts of bits of lyrics that appear all over the place. They're almost like a moving chunk you can take and put where you want. But there's a whole rich line of that through these songs, isn't there?
Totally. And I think that, so just to go back to their origin story, I say we because I've had so much input from other scholars and, other musicians and so forth. But the contention that these songs in the beginning were what we would call one-verse songs. These are songs that were maybe a single line or a couplet, and that might have been the entire song, and this was just repeated with variations over and over again. Or, more likely, you might attach another line. So you would have a song that was a refrain plus another line, and then the next day it might be something totally different. This kind of elasticity in lyrics, that these were not songs that were fully organized the way that we may think of songs today, that they have a verse and then a chorus and then a verse and then a chorus and then a solo and, something like that. In the early going, it seems to have been very, very flexible and elastic. And I think that, when I was reading the WPA Slave Narrative Collection, which there were 10 women and men who mentioned Liza Jane songs, often with different titles, different lyrics, different performance rituals. This, I think, in a way, really corroborates that theory, because it there was just a lot of regional variation, apparently, to how these songs were performed. So, this is part of what I was getting at a little earlier, something messy that I was saying was, when you have jazz music coming into the picture, and jazz was inherently an improvisational form, but, now that you have recordings and musicians are going to try and make money by selling recordings as opposed to sheet music or something, or books or things like that, you now have to sort of organize these songs, condense them, and so forth. And so you would see that there's so many different recordings of Little Liza Jane alone, because the tradition reaches people in different ways. And when they organized them to appear on record, they were just very different. or if they organized them for a folk music field recordist like Alan or John Lomax or somebody like that. Also, a lot of those regional variations. So it's to say that their ultimate elasticity is something that we still see today because there's just so many different versions. But this is also emblematic of how American music, again, this is a messy thing to say, but how it has, come to be an American school of music, that it is inherently improvisational. And the great figure of Louis Armstrong, who is somebody who probably did more than anybody to assert and identify the virtuosity of the soloist, the importance of the soloist. This is something that continues in music that you see in rock and roll and many other forms, and certainly in jazz. Liza Jane is very much like that in many ways.
Well, and it's really interesting because that sort of point about regionality, there's so many elements just to that, in that you could probably, within a 100-mile radius, wander around different places and hear different versions of a song, but there could be elements of the song that had come from certain places in Africa, for example, by the people who brought it with them, then were shipped off to various destinations and took it with them. And then that, and so there's so many kind of subtleties to how stuff changes regionally from origin, but then being replanted and then coming back together. And then what, it's easy to jump ahead to the idea that the recording industry and sheet music and things somehow brought these strands together. But one of the fascinating bits in the book is this idea of the role the Civil War plays in kind of, suddenly you have this mass movement of people from all over the country and different backgrounds, different, bringing that song with them. And, that's a really interesting kind of point in the story, I think.
Totally. The Civil War details are some of the greatest details in the book. They involve regiments. They involve a Civil War correspondent himself named Dr. Adonis, whose real identity was somewhat uncertain. An interesting minor character in a book that I think really is built ultimately by many minor characters. You're right. On the one hand, so you have different forces here. One is you have enslaved people who are actually being liberated or feeling liberated and are moving towards the encampments of Union soldiers to protect themselves. And they are, according to numerous musicologists, they are, singing. And this is one, obvious way in which I think it's likely that our friend Dr. Adonis overheard a Liza Jane song and wrote about it in 1864 in the newspaper. You also have regiments who seem to know the song through other means. And in particular, one of the greatest single stories I think that the book can offer is the United States Colored Troops Regiment, number 43, the 43rd United States Colored Troops Regiment, is being organized in Philadelphia. Travels down probably to Baltimore, and the train marches over to Annapolis, where a regimental historian, some years later, says that they were singing Goodbye, Liza Jane. And from there, this regiment marches past Abraham Lincoln in Washington, as this 43rd USCT was the first colored troops regiment to be attached to the Army of the Potomac. So this was something that the newspapers were covering and so forth. They march past Lincoln and they go to Spotsylvania Courthouse for the Battle of the Wilderness, which was a large-scale battle, an inconclusive 1864 battle in the springtime in Virginia. Now, then you have a Confederate regiment known as the PD Guards from North Carolina, and they too are marching towards the Battle of the Wilderness at Spotsylvania Courthouse. And the regimental historian for this unit is mentioning that they are singing a song called Galang Liza Jane, or Get Along Liza Jane, probably a related song to Goodbye Liza Jane. They are marching towards the same battle. So you have a Union regiment all composed of African-American soldiers. You have a white regiment from the Confederacy. And the symbolism couldn't be more obvious here. that you have all of this divisiveness and separation. You have colors of the uniform, their political beliefs, white and black, what they're fighting for. And yet they're singing versions of the same song, which is, I think, is an extremely powerful part of the Liza Jane story. How so many of us know these songs, even as we might feel divisions that are obviously quite considerable today. And so, the sense that you have people moving around, whether it is enslaved people moving towards what were unfortunately called contraband camps, where they were near Union soldiers, or you have, the regiments themselves who are singing these songs. And so these songs are transferring then. It's unclear how much of how much these songs might have leaked out from African-American folk culture during the years of the antebellum South, especially if you have enslaved men and women working on, let's say, the Mississippi River system. And, that's another sort of way that these songs might have gotten around. But from what I can tell, most of the songs, if not all of them, kind of kept in folk tradition until the Civil War years, when demonstrably they definitely came out.
And it's sort of one of the really interesting points about all of this in the book is the idea of this being a song that has passed freely between white and black communities in both directions over time, many times. And it doesn't feel like there were two distinct variants that then came together and divided off again. It feels, from what I read in the book, that it's sort of all been everywhere all the time. And it seems very hard to kind of go, it's not like two tributaries that form a river which then splits off again. It's such a patchwork of different influences and different kind of sources.
Yeah, because another folk song that I've looked into that I know a little bit more than average about would be In the Pines. And In the Pines is a song that seems to be a composite in a certain way that you just kind of mentioned, where you have sort of an earlier version of In the Pines comes together with another song called The Longest Train. And this makes sort of similarities in tune enable this kind of thing. And so that is the version that more or less was played by Bill Monroe, played by Leadbelly, and ultimately made really famous by Nirvana at MTV Unplugged many years later, as they were trying to sound like Leadbelly and then created something altogether kind of different, to say the least. But the Liza Jane trajectory, which I think is, so there are things to say about In the Pines, as I think it's a very important, interesting cultural force. And I may work with that song a little bit more in the future, but it doesn't have the same kind of history as Liza Jane. The Liza Jane history, as you say, is muddy, sludgy. It drifts in and out of the hilltops and the hamlets and the hollers, where there was a fair amount of cultural exchange that isn't widely documented. So I'm remembering one newspaper article that I came across where there was some guy identified as a Reverend such and such. There's 5,000 names to remember in this story. Mm-hmm. Maybe Reverend Hanford Edson or something like this. And he was on a mountaintop in the Appalachian Hills, probably in North Carolina or Tennessee, or where both come together. And he was talking about how Black musicians had influenced the songs that he was reporting on. In that, this is in the mid or late 1890s, right around there, or the early 1890s. I'm not quite remembering, but fully documented there how this Poor Gal song had developed and came together based upon the influences of different traditions. And so even as he carefully asserted a kind of apartheid of sorts, that he was saying, well, these are the Black musicians who live here are not the equals of the white musicians and so forth. Nevertheless, their music has, sort of traded hands. And that was an important little article in some ways to, sort of, yes, this is, some people, when they think of playing traditional music, or, and they say, well, this comes from the hills, or this is an old song, and there's not quite more information than that. But in the history of tracking all these different Liza Jane variants, that information did come out in many ways. We talking about the Civil War, and then in the years to follow, as African Americans could live in different places and weren't so institutionally restricted as during the years in slavery, these kinds of interactions were more possible. A young Uncle Am Stewart, who is an old-time fiddler who recorded as an older guy in the 1920s, he refers to trying to fiddle in African-American encampments, probably during the Civil War, and was chased out of there because he wasn't playing very well. But likely that this was the fact that he mentioned this and this was reported on in the newspaper. It's likely that that kind of exchange was happening even in those years too.
And there's also a sort of strong sense in the book that minstrelsy plays an important role in the way this song is disseminated and popularized and moves around again, because sort of pre-recording and film and radio and those things, sort of minstrelsy has an important role to play in the development of kind of the way music was written down as well. Like, songs were popularized through shows, but also you then get sheet music coming out of that, and this sense of starting to kind of pin things down in versions a little bit more.
Indeed. And it's important to point out that not all Liza Jane songs seem to have a history in minstrelsy. The biggest one is Goodbye Liza Jane. The history of Goodbye Liza Jane is incredibly complicated and interesting, but complicated. We know that Goodbye Liza Jane was in the air during the Civil War, and it was adopted by minstrelsy troops before there was an 1871 publication of sheet music by a guy named Eddie Fox, who was a Philadelphia area band leader, a well-paid, well-known minstrel violinist and band leader. And so he publishes Goodbye Liza Jane, and then you see a number of different variations after that in minstrelsy and then in Tin Pan Alley and in some other contexts before that kind of lineage peters out a little bit, fortunately. Minstrelsy is an incredibly unfortunate thing in many ways. It is what I sometimes call the entertainment wing of the plantation system. And, it's really horrendous on the one hand if you have, white men blacking up, applying burnt cork makeup to appear as both African-American men and women and acting foolishly and so forth. It did reach large audiences, however, and that history does have to be acknowledged in the book as part of what happened to the Liza Jane family. But, there is Goodbye Liza Jane out there right now, and I think some of the musicians who you've interviewed for your series of play Goodbye Liza Jane, but there's again some historical differences here that might be worth quickly pointing out. There was something called the play party, and the play party was not for little kids. It was adults gathering to have dances and songs, but without musical instruments because that was forbidden by the church. So they had to clap and sing and make noise with their feet. And at the end of the day, there may have not been musical instruments, but there was whiskey and, all sorts of messing around. So, but the one requirement was met. So there was no fiddle. There was no music of the devil's box. And in this environment, Goodbye Liza Jane was transformed, it appears, into something non-racial, a swing song, probably the most popular rendition of it in the 20th century, anyhow, was by Bob Wills, who makes he joins fiddles and string instruments with horns and his Western swing sound. And he recorded the song a few times, and also it appears in a movie. So the Goodbye Liza Jane that we have today probably originates with enslaved people. We hear about in the Civil War. We, again, it drifts into minstrelsy, where it is a hit, unquestionably. It is performed all over the world, in the United States by numerous troops and throughout the English-speaking world, and South Africa, England, Australia, before it sort of drifts out of favor with Tin Pan Alley, and the resulting song that takes its place has its origins in the play party environment, which is a non-racial song that is a dance song, and fortunately is something that doesn't really relate all too much to the minstrel version. So yeah, and there are other Liza Jane songs that appear in minstrelsy, songs that may be called My Little Old Liza Jane or Little Old Liza Jane, but are really not what we know Little Liza Jane to be. And Little Liza Jane appears to have stayed in folk tradition until it appears in the early part of the 20th century, in part in sheet music, but in some other ways too. The sheet music was also called a dialect song, and so it was published with show business dialect, which is not flattering to African Americans, but it was first performed, that sheet music was first performed in a more or less in a Broadway play, and did not involve burnt cork makeup or anything of that kind.
And is there some sort of sense that particular kind of variants of the song kind of became popular in certain, like, as the recording industry started to take shape, and songs were often recorded by various artists marketed to different people, rather than presuming different people would buy the same version? Did you tend to find that sort of Goodbye Liza Jane was recorded more and aimed more at one market, and Little Liza Jane potentially another?
Yeah, and so the first recording of a Liza Jane song, as far as we know, was done by an African American recording star, sometimes referred to as the first African American recording star, a guy named George W. Johnson, who was a street artist living in New York. He sort of whistled and laughed and sang, and somebody discovered him, and brought him into the studio in the 1890s, where he started, recording the kinds of songs that made use of his skills, which were considerable. So he has a hit. He has some early hits, and these were on cylinders. And in order to hear these songs, there'd be somebody walking around or set up outside somewhere who had like listening tubes, and you would give him a nickel, and you'd hold this tube up to your ear, and you'd hear a song, or you'd hear the Marine Corps band. You'd hear something by somebody who wasn't there, and this was such a miracle at the time. That to think that you were hearing something that maybe even somebody who had passed away, and there's a whole set of things to say about that, but it was very, very different from what we have today. Of course, George W. Johnson would frequently sing in a way that maybe 5 or 6 cylinders were made at once. So he would go to a recording studio and be there for quite a while, and they'd, cut a certain number of cylinder recordings, and they would be distributed to, these vendors, or as they became more popular, people had devices at home that could play these things. But anyhow, so when he is cultivating additional material, one of the songs he turns to is a version of Goodbye Liza Jane, which was very heavily influenced by minstrelsy. So he is taking something at this point back from, the changing hands that we've talked about. This is from Civil War regiments to minstrelsy band leaders, and now back to the first African-American recording star, who is somewhat abasing himself in performing this song, but is making a living the way that he had to in those days to, be a singer. And so that's, one kind of thing. But then, this is one of the earliest examples. This is to, be paid for something. And the market is these roving, vendors who have, this new technology. We could probably talk endlessly about the different markets that people tried to reach in Liza Jane recordings. But one thing we haven't talked about yet is the Ten of a Ramblers, who were present at the Bristol sessions. And the Bristol sessions are sometimes called the Big Bang in country music, although there were many popular records that came before by some of the people we've mentioned already, Uncle Am Stewart, Fiddle and John Carson, and people like that. But the Ten of a Ramblers were at the Bristol sessions, and they recorded and sang Miss Liza Poor Gal. And so there you go. This is a new thing. Record companies, what was this guy, Ralph Peer, was trying to reach these new markets. And so these, there's the Carter family was there, Jimmy Rogers was there, and so forth. These musicians are showing up, trying to make hay out of this new opportunity. And there's Liza Jane, once again, the song that keeps popping up as a choice by the musicians who are trying to capitalize upon something that's happening in American culture, whether it's a new musical genre coming about, or, perhaps we'll get into Harry Belafonte later, but, the civil rights movement. There are many other things. And the market then becomes also television and film and, animations and things like that.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that that whole process of, whoever happened to turn up on the day at the Bristol sessions with the song they brought with them in the version that they happened to have brought with them, or, when a Lomax is wandering around with a tape recorder, or Cecil Sharp is wandering around with a notebook and a pen, like the idea that one person's version becomes everybody's version. And I find that endlessly fascinating, the way these songs kind of morph and settle and then morph again. And as you say, particularly jazz and string band music, they're such improvisatory mediums that you end up with something that, there's plenty of versions out there that are just treated like a fiddle tune and there's no vocal at all, or some that are, like a tune, but they will retain the chorus, or some that are delivered as songs. And it's one of the fascinating things about the constant reinvention of this music. Just when you think it's been pinned down, it, finds another route out into the world.
Yeah, totally. Because also, as we've talked about a little bit, their inherent nature as improvisational songs with many different lyrics and many different titles. And, that's just kind of irrepressible that, somebody will make a great recording, but, there is, there's this other version that, somebody else is going to bring to the table. How about Fats Domino and Smiley Lewis? They are in New Orleans in late 1950s. They are both recording Little Liza Jane. The producer is the same. It's the great Dave Bartholomew, trumpeter and producer. They're both on the same label, which is Imperial. I believe they had many, if not all, of the same side musicians, including Herb Hardesty, I think, on tenor saxophone. And they're completely different. I mean, these are Fats Domino is, let's go down to the record hop. Little Liza Jane. We'll get there about 8 o'clock. Little Liza Jane. And, Huey Pianos, Smiley Lewis starts off his version by saying, I got a gal in Irontown, Little Liza Jane. And it's just different lyrics, different arrangements, but all the similarities in those recordings. And yet you have these two kind of concepts of what a hit will be, and two, different traditions in terms of, lyrics and presentations and so forth. So that's just one example of many. You also mentioned, the Lomaxes and, what they encountered as they were traveling around. And even in that same area, in the sort of Louisiana parishes that they went into in the early 30s, coming up with still very different, like, folk versions of Little Liza Jane. Wilson Stave and Chain Jones was the leader of that group. And a few months earlier, I think in Texas, they come across Pete Harris, who sings a kind of cowboy medley, dance calls, square dance kind of a thing of Little Liza Jane, but other parts of the tradition. So it's wild. There's a lot going on.
Well, you mentioned Harry Belafonte, and there's one, and it takes up maybe half a page in the book, but there's like a little list of people who've recorded this song at a certain point. And I look, and just in the space of 8 years, like starting in 1956, there's kind of Huey Piano Smith, Merle Travis, Hank Thompson, Pete Seeger, Fats Domino, Nina Simone, Harry Belafonte, Dwayne Eddy, Coleman Hawkins, John Reno and Red Smiley, Mississippi John Hurt, New Lost City Ramblers. And that's like the threads you can pull on from there of jazz, of rock and roll, of the folk revival, of the civil rights movement, of like that. There's a world just in that 8 years of, and that's the highlights of recordings. That's not everything that was recorded in those years. There's so much. Like there's an hour's conversation you could have about any of those threads.
Yeah, and there are many heavyweights in there, obviously, and through New Lost City Ramblers, there is almost a murder ballad. It's a really borderline song in terms of what they're singing about, which ultimately descends from Carter Brothers and Son, which is a personal favorite of mine. There's just so much in there to talk about. If we have a chance to talk a little bit more about Belafonte, that would be great. But yeah, I mean, take your pick in there, and many of those versions are actually really great too. One of the key characteristics about these songs is that very few of them are shy songs. They're dance songs. They're meant to be said loudly. And some, like you said, are instrumentals. One of the greatest instrumental versions is the Kessinger brothers, who were uncle and nephew, Clark Kessinger and Lucas Kessinger. And that's a 3-minute waltz, basically, that is really beautiful, really amazing. But yeah, that 8 years is a magical time period. The Nina Simone version is arguably the greatest of all of them. I think that Nina Simone, it might even be Nina Simone's greatest song. She communicates with the Liza Jane character in a trance-like way that is just really pretty captivating and gripping. The footage is alive now on YouTube, and there's also some additional information about how she introduced the song, saying that it was a folk song that she had heard all her life. And I imagine that I believe her grandparents, who had been enslaved, there's probably some likelihood that that's where it came from. But she has a really remarkable, unique arrangement of the song. She has a couple of different choruses. She puts her stamp on it, and it's really, really amazing version.
Yeah, just even the simple thing of flipping, I got a boy and you got none. Like even just that flipping of it, regardless of the rest of it. And it's such a sonically beautiful version as well. Like it's such a lovely sonic world to step into for a few minutes. It's extraordinary, isn't it? But you mentioned Harry Belafonte again. I think that's one of the threads I would like to pull on, if you could talk about that a bit, because I think that's particularly interesting. I think one of what is beautiful about a book like this is that you follow a thread through time. And as you say, it's not quite as linear as that, but like Liza Jane in all her guises experiences America as it becomes America, all the good bits, all the bad bits, all the difficult bits to talk about. Like that's what makes something like this interesting, because it has survived through all of that, changed the world, been changed by the world. And that particular kind of point is a really interesting time to sort of focus in on, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, I'm not going to pretend that the book doesn't have its faults. It's a messy book. It was really difficult to try and organize everything, and I'm sure it drops the ball in certain places. But when Harry Belafonte steps up to do his second televised special for CBS, and it's important that his sponsor was Revlon, a cosmetics company, because this is really a moment where the history of American performance and minstrelsy intersects with the civil rights movement, segregation, and an activist singer like Belafonte really trying to do something about that. So Belafonte had won an Emmy Award as a producer, the first time an African-American producer had won an Emmy, and in 1959 for his first special, and this was with his co-star Odetta. And for this next special, which was called New York 19, that was the old postal code in New York City for the Performing Arts District. And so he was going to do the folk music that appeared in that district. So it would be Irish music and Jewish music, Yiddish music, and folk, other kinds of folk music, jazz, and so forth. he uses a mixed race cast of musicians, dancers, and singers. So it was the modern jazz quartet, which was an all black group, for example, and the contemporary string quartet, which was an all white group, and they were together playing, and you could see the dancers, the whirling dancers, were not all African American, as in his first special. So here was Belafonte in 1960 giving a bold new vision of American performance, which would include everybody, versus the segregation and that was being played out in many ugly ways in lunch counters throughout the South and so forth. All the horrible imagery, just trying to suppress a white person and a black person from sitting next to each other at a lunch counter. So the special happens, and it appears that Little Liza Jane involved the whole company and was the last song. And there is an exhausted Harry Belafonte at the very end of that clip, exhaling as the dancing stops and the camera kind of pulls up, and a great hit show. Everybody was very positive about this. He's talk of another Emmy. And then he is summoned to Revlon headquarters in New York City there to talk about a problem, which is that he was getting complaints. The Revlon CEO or whoever was getting complaints about from Southern television stations about the integrated performance. And if he's going to do future shows for Revlon, these shows would have to be resegregated. It would have to be, an all black group of performers. And Belafonte says no. And, I'm not going to resegregate. And his contract is canceled. And, again, there's almost perfect symbolism here, as there was with the Civil War example, the two different regiments marching to fight in the same battle. Here you have a cosmetics company requiring a certain kind of ugliness that used to exist in minstrelsy. And, fortunately, I think Belafonte was a really, from what I can tell as a human being, he was very unwavering in his beliefs. And he just, the money didn't matter to him. His principles mattered. And so he said no. And this is another example of when a performer turns to Liza Jane at a moment, where, something is at stake, where there's a new vision of American performance. And this is a song I'm going to use. I can't say why, other than it's a dance song. It's a loud song. It's a joyous song. I don't know how much of it Harry Belafonte understood in terms of its history, but it's no mistake that this kind of goes on when these performers, maybe some of them just want to have a hit, but I think there's something in the DNA of the song that lends itself to this kind of expression, and as one of the biggest moments in the history of the Liza Jane family.
And it's a song that is clearly then sort of, the folk revival is well underway by that point, but we often think of the folk revival as being a sort of late 50s, early 60s thing, just because so many of the performers that sort of came out of that world and went on to become sort of stars came out of that particular period. But again, a song that, you would then hear Dot Watson sing, or it's and on through the point. There's a version on Alison Krauss's, one of Alison Krauss's early records, and it's like probably less than 2 minutes long. It's just an instrumental version of that tune, and it's Martin Simpson has recorded it, and like it's still Tony Trishka's Earl Jam record that came out earlier this year. There's a version on there that's largely instrumental with an astonishing vocal performance from Dan McCoury, and it is still a joyful, loud, like exciting song that has all of this. It's a song that manages to have an extraordinary amount of history without somehow having any baggage, if that makes sense. It is still a song that can just be enjoyed, and a song that can also be studied, and neither of those things seems to diminish the other.
No, and I will occasionally get emails from music teachers who are saying that, okay, their principals or whoever have heard that this was a minstrelsy song, or this was, a song that enslaved people, might have sung, and so they're not letting me teach this song, for me to like respond to an email like that with all the complexity that, sort of accompanies the Liza Jane family is impossible. But I try to reassure them that in the case of enslaved people, this was a celebration song that they developed themselves and they were not forced to sing. And in the case of a song like Goodbye Liza Jane, which, yes, does have the minstrelsy connection, nevertheless, the version that is out there today, that was also, I want to point out, the Play Party version was recorded recently by Nora Brown, who from 1921, she calls Liza Jane, and it's on her album called Sidetrack My Engine. That is I think, a masterpiece song. It's beautiful, and with Blind Boy Paxton doing percussion, it's continues to be relevant and not something that anybody should take offense from, even though, yes, there's some complexity and so forth, but that baggage is not present today in any way. Shouldn't be.
And somehow the response to an email saying you can't teach this because of this, like the complexity of it is the reason you should teach it. So you can you can dive into all of that and let people make their own minds up. And, it's, I think we sometimes look for easy ways of putting stuff back in boxes today. And it's funny because I'd never heard, obviously, with all of that, one of the things that grabs people's attention is the idea that David Bowie's recorded this song, and you go back and listen to it, and it's sort of an early David Jones before even he'd realised he was David Bowie, sort of in a very typical kind of 60s British kind of white kids playing R&B tune. The Stones were doing it, the Yardbirds were doing it, Jimmy Page, like everybody was trying to be bluesmen in the early 60s in London. And it's a fairly forgettable one of those, really. But it's funny that like that song has somehow made its way into that thread of pop music as well, even if it's almost a tiny footnote. It's an interesting thing to note. But it's such a span of history and culture and music, and it's that glorious bit of American music becoming American music alongside recording and alongside all the things that went on in the sort of early middle of the 20th century. And it's a fascinating thread, and there's so many things we could have talked about we haven't had a chance to. And I just wanted to thank you for kind of taking the time to talk about the things we've managed to.
Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate your kind words about the book and the thoughtfulness of the questions, which has been really great. If there's chance for us to talk again and get into the 10,000 things we didn't talk about, I'd be happy to do that. But I really, really appreciate this very much.
I've really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to sort of seeing what sort of form the film project takes, because that's another chance to do something different again and highlight different things there. And is there a podcast as well, did I read?
Yeah, so people who want to keep in touch with the Liza Jane project as it's going on can find us easily on the web. It's lizajanemovie.com. My co-producer, Emily Cohen, and I did create the first version of a podcast that we are tentatively calling American Song Bag, which is a reference to the Carl Sandburg folk music book that he published in 1927. And we are, we're doing a lot of different things. We're both a little underemployed in my case and overemployed in Emily's case. And so we're trying to manage a lot of different pulls and tugs on ourselves. But we hope to push forward with that as well, and to make this the kind of project that has print, audio, and film.
Wonderful. Well, I'll put a link to that in the show notes so people can come and find it, and a link to your website too if people want to come and find out more and find out where they can get the book. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, man. I really appreciate this.
Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collinsguitars.com and find out why.